I'm Austin Koplarczyk, arranger and composer. I'm currently in my third year of undergraduate schooling, studying composition. I've only been a composer in the official sense for about 4 years now, but throughout that time, I like to think I've learned a fair bit about composing, the world of composing, and composers. And it's inspired me in a way I wasn't really expecting. So I figured if you're like me, you might enjoy hearing about the kind of people that inspire other composers. And maybe you'll find someone you didn't know about that interests you. Though I'll warn you now, sometimes it's better not to look into your heroes, but I'll cycle back to that later. So, in no particular order, here are some of my favorite composers, and why I look up to them or respect them. When I began composing, it was jazz. I was arranging for jazz band, which led to me submitting a piece for the essentially Ellington composition contest. I didn't win, obviously, otherwise I'd talk about it a whole lot more, but I was inspired to start because of Duke. It stems from a practice that I read Duke Ellington engaged in, this kind of Ellingtonian school of composition, as I like to call it. The story goes that Duke didn't write for instruments, he wrote for the people playing them. One example of this is another hero of mine, for a different reason, Harry Carney, who was the bari sax player for the orchestra, and the longest member, aside from Ellington, to be in the Duke Ellington Orchestra. Looking at his part for Symphonette, which would become Sugar Hill Penthouse when Duke later included it in the black, brown, and beige suite, you can see that there are names and not instruments on the top. The parts pictured were written for Otto Hardwick and Harry Carney, both players in the band at the time it was written. And you'll notice that their names replace any instrument name in the part. And this simple philosophy astounded me. I was so intrigued and fascinated and in love with this concept. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I still can't. And it still kind of fuels my writing to a point where these distinctive voices, whether they be people I know or just images I have of a sound, really influence how I write for certain instruments. And I don't think my infatuation with this idea is ever going to diminish. If I ever get the chance to run a long-term orchestra, I really hope to emulate this entire concept, as much as I can. Now, Charles Ives is not the first person most people think of when talking about Duke Ellington, but the two occupy a very similar space in my thinking. Ives approaches his music in such a fascinating way. He was so isolated from the mainstream of his day, and even when he worked and interacted with celebrated musicians at the time, he'd just get frustrated and upset because they wouldn't see his vision in the music. One piece that really speaks to me is the Concord Sonata, a favorite of mine. Ooh. Which Ives says he never really stopped writing. It claims, in here, that it was mostly composed from 1911 to 1912, but then didn't consider the last two movements complete till 1915. But then he wrote a set of essays called The Essays Before a Sonata in 1919, which was then published along with a version of the sonata in 1920. And then he did a revised version, which is the version I have a printing of, that he prepared from 1940 to 1947, until about a few years before his death. And something about this general uncooperative attitude with the mainstream, and his whole double life as a successful and innovative insurance executive and composer, and his refusal to believe that his music was ever really finished. He'd just constantly be working on things and fixing it and making it better. It spoke to me on some deeper level. I have a vinyl of the Concord Sonata that talks about Ives in detail that I frequently look to when I need inspiration or motivation. I don't have it on me, unfortunately, otherwise I'd show it. But Ives was also an outstanding pianist, Nothing he wrote for piano was unplayable by him, which I really wish I could emulate in him, but one day, maybe. If you've seen other content on my channel, you'll probably know that I'm obsessed with Bela Bartok. That sounds a bit harsh. I am very infatuated with the music of Bela Bartok. Captivated by his music, his philosophies, his whole mission and life goal. They resonate so deeply with me, and they just speak to me. I'm someone who didn't have a great anchor in my early life, and I turned to coping mechanisms that weren't exactly healthy or good in any way. And it took me a lot of time to come back around to healthier motivations, but when I did, it was in a way that was deeply connected to my personal heritage. I grew up in a town that was dominated by a Polish heritage, and I'm happy for that, as it gave me something positive to latch onto once I managed to turn things around, and gave me a lot of memories that I really cherish to this day. And that's kind of where I connect with Bartok, I think. He grew up and lived through turbulent times, living in the early part of the 20th century, up until the late 40s. And when he reached out for an anchor or something to ground himself in, he found his heritage. Bartok, in my opinion, and I'm sure this is one that's shared by many people, was a leader in early ethnomusicology, along with peers Zoltan and Kodály, and many others. And I've recently been very inspired in my own writing and research to follow in his footsteps. Percy Grainger is where my story from earlier comes back around. When I looked into Grainger for a project about 2 years ago, I learned the strange and not exactly hidden history that he happens to have. Two things keep him very controversial. One, which I assume is a little less controversial these days, is he was a very enthusiastic sadomasochist. Very open about it with his friends and family. When he built his own museum in Australia, donated a number of whips and other fetish items to it. Was very open about it in his many letters that he preserved. So yeah, there's that one. The second one, probably the more concerning one these days, he was also racist in a fair number of ways. Now, I'll take a moment here to point out that while he was a firm believer in the superiority of blue-eyed, blonde Northern Europeans, this racism was rather confusing and eccentrically applied by all sources, as demonstrated by his, love and interest for basically non-Nordic folk music, and him being one of the very first professor, as far as I'm aware, to invite a jazz band to perform at any university, Duke Ellington's orchestra, in fact, and was a huge proponent of jazz music at a time where it was looked down in the mainstream because it was a predominantly black art form. There are a number of other weird citations, but he was also openly racist and anti-Semitic. And as strange as this sounds, I don't believe this makes him a bad person. Which, yes, sounds bad. I disavow his racism and his anti-Semitic concepts. Don't agree with him. But I respect his understanding that he was far from perfect. He was very open about this because he knew it wasn't what should be. You know what I mean? He was very open about his flaws because he wanted to be judged for all of them, as well as his successes and his accomplishments. He wanted them to be judged in tandem. And the more I research into that, the more I think I can respect that viewpoint. His willingness to be so open with the world so that people will judge him accurately. And, Grainger's music was always straining towards wildness and freedom. And it's as unconventional and probably strange at times as the man itself was. And I don't think I would want it any other way. And of course, there are many others. And to go through every single person that inspires me and my music in some way, we'd be here for days, if not weeks. But I hope from watching this video, you managed to understand a bit of how I approach my writing and why I approach it the way I do. And maybe you'll come to find something in yourself, something you can find, your motivations, who inspires you to do what you want to do. You know, and if it made you think at all, I'd love to hear it in the comments. And if you liked the video, feel free to like it, of course. Check out my channel, there's more composing content by the week. And, you know, I look forward to seeing you next time. So thanks.